Hello, Adult Sunday School Leader. Well, Ruth and I made it back safely from South Carolina, so we're back here in Arkansas and looking forward to this coming Sunday's lesson. Well, remember, we're in that unit that's called All Signs Point to Jesus. This is lesson number 5, called The Sign of His Presence. And our focal passage is out of John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. The point of this lesson is, in Jesus' presence, we have no need to fear. Well, this week's lesson text is only 6 verses long. So in class, I'm probably going to read the entire passage rather than dividing it into the 3 sections as the curriculum suggests that we do. Well, the lesson picks up immediately after last week's passage. Well, our focus this week is on Jesus walking on the water. It's another well-known story from John's Gospel. And there are 2 parallel accounts of this miracle. We see one in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. We see the other in Mark chapter 6, verses 45 through 52. But it's not recorded in Luke's Gospel. Well, John's version, the version we're looking at this week, it's the shortest of the 3. And it emphasizes Jesus' divine power over nature, while Matthew and Mark provide some additional details, particularly about the disciples' reactions. Well, Matthew's account uniquely includes Peter walking on the water before fear causes him to sink, while Mark's version closely aligns with John's. Well, have you ever used any AI tools like ChatGPT? Well, like any other resource, it can become a crutch if it's overused, but it can also be a valuable tool. While it's not perfect, just like commentaries, it can provide helpful insights. I asked ChatGPT to combine the details of all of 3 of the gospel accounts into a single, complete narrative of Jesus walking on the water. And here's what it produced. After Jesus had miraculously fed the 5,000, he perceived that the people were about to take him by force and make him king. To avoid this, he immediately made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side toward Bethsaida from Capernaum, while he dismissed the crowd. After sending the people away, Jesus went up on a mountain by himself to pray. By evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, being tossed by the waves, for the wind was against them. The disciples were straining at the oars, struggling to make progress as they faced a strong wind. Sometime during the 4th watch of the night, between 3 and 6 a.m., Jesus came toward them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified, thinking it was a ghost, and they cried out in fear. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then Peter answered, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Peter stepped out of the boat and began walking on the water toward Jesus, but when he saw the strong wind, he became afraid and began to sink, crying out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand, caught him, saying, "O you of little faith, why do you doubt?" When they climbed into the boat, the wind ceased. The disciples were utterly astounded, for they had not understood the miracle of the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. Those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And immediately the boat reached the shore where they were going. So there you have it, the complete account of this miraculous sign. The disciples were near Bethsaida and were heading across the Sea of Galilee toward Capernaum. And this might be a great opportunity to see if anyone remembers those 2 other names for this body of water that we learned last week. It was the Sea of Tiberias and Lake Gennesaret. Well, let's take just a moment and talk about the geographical features of the Sea of Galilee. The lake sits 650 feet below sea level, and it's surrounded by hills. And it makes it especially vulnerable to sudden squalls that can produce dangerously high waves. But did you notice that Jesus made the disciples get into the boat while he stayed behind? He wasn't unaware of the storm that was going to happen. They weren't just facing the possibility of rough waters. Jesus knew with certainty that the storm would come that evening. So that's something worth tucking away for future reflection. Just because you find yourself in a storm doesn't mean God's punishing you or that Jesus has abandoned you. Sometimes he intentionally sends us through that storm for a greater purpose. Well, the disciples found themselves in a literal storm. One of those sudden squalls had swept across the water. They must have been exhausted, as Scripture says, that they were straining at the oars while trying to row toward Capernaum. Well, after rowing 3 or 4 hours, or 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea. But instead of feeling comforted, they were terrified. Well, why is that? Well, this was something they had never seen before. No one had ever walked on water. And with the wind howling and the waves crashing against the boat, they weren't exactly on a peaceful lake in broad daylight. Okay, they were in the midst of a storm, and all they could probably make out was this figure approaching them on the water. So naturally, they assumed it had to be a ghost. After all, no human could do what they were witnessing. Yet Jesus didn't scold them for their fear. Instead, he immediately reassured them, saying, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Well, in Greek, that phrase, "it is I," is ego eimi, which literally means I am. This phrase appears 24 times in the Gospel of John and is the same expression Jesus used in his famous I am statements, such as, "I am the bread of life," out of John 6:35, or "I am the good shepherd," out of John 10, verse 11. And most strikingly, Jesus declared, "Before Abraham was, I am." By using ego eimi, the I am, Jesus was identifying himself with God by connecting directly to Exodus 3:14, where God revealed his name to Moses at the burning bush when he said, "I am that I am." Well, in this moment on the stormy sea, Jesus was doing more than calming their fears. He was revealing his divine identity. This miraculous event contains multiple signs of Jesus' divinity. Jesus walked on the water. Peter walked on the water. Jesus calmed the storm. And after Jesus got into the boat, they immediately reached their destination. Well, last week we explored the connection between John 6 and Psalm 23. So here's another thought. In last week's story, Jesus led his people to green pastures. And in this week's lesson, he brought them to still waters. Well, this imagery further emphasizes his role as our divine shepherd, guiding and protecting his flock through every storm. So here are some takeaways from this story. One is, Jesus is aware of the struggles we're in. Jesus comes to us when we are in the storms of life. But, it's up to us to invite him into the boat. Or we can just keep on rowing against the wind. Jesus, the Creator, is in control over his creation. He walked on the water. He calmed the sea. When we survive a storm of life, worshiping Jesus is the right response. At the end of the story in Matthew, the disciples stated, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So this story challenges us to ask, when I'm in a storm, do I keep my eyes on Jesus or do I focus on the wind and the waves? It also forces us to ask, am I worshiping and trusting Jesus in every season of my life? But no matter what the storm is you're going through, Jesus says, "Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid." Well, next week we're going to be in John chapter 9, looking at Jesus healing a blind man. Well, thank you guys so much for watching. I do appreciate you. And don't forget, pray for and with your class.